Welcome to Measuring Success Right, the official podcast of the Marriott Student Review, a podcast for students by students, where we connect the leaders of tomorrow with the issues of today.
Well, we are so excited that Niko Pfund has decided to join us today for Measuring Success Right. He is the president and academic publisher at Oxford University Press. Thank you for joining us, Niko.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. We're so happy to have you. Well, I've got a couple questions for you, and then we'll finish up with our typical question, which is, how do you measure success in your own life? But my first question is, how has your concept of the ideal job or profession changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's funny because years ago when we were going on college trips with my two daughters, there was a career counseling person who joined the informational session and described themselves as being 32 years old and already having had 6 different careers. And I didn't want to be specious about it and raise my hand and say, actually, I think you've had 6 different jobs. You haven't really had 6 different careers unless you've lived a very, very compressed life. But, semantics aside, I do think my professional life is somewhat unusual by today's standards because there's been a constancy to it. From the moment I started, I left college and 2 months later began working at Oxford University Press, left Oxford for 10 years to work at another press before coming back, but have worked for 2 not-for-profit university presses over the entirety of my now 35-year career. And it's been tremendous. I've enjoyed it enormously. And I think that one of the things about being in book publishing, and I suspect there are other industries where this is not dissimilar, I think journalism comes most readily to mind. But even if you're doing the same things in terms of the mechanics or the logistics, you're doing them about something different every time. So we have editorial board meetings every Tuesday morning where a group of 30 to 40 people get together and discuss book projects, discuss their intellectual merit, discuss their commercial potential, discuss their suitability for our publishing program. And I find that today, as I did the very first time I joined that meeting as an intimidated new employee, now I largely run that meeting most often, and I find it to be constantly rejuvenating. So I think that having a profession where one is reanimated by it on a regular basis, I think is really just one of the most important things in terms of feeling like one has lived a valuable life. And I would say I come from a family of teachers. My wife is a teacher, my mother is a teacher, my sister is a teacher, my grandfather was a teacher. And I don't think that what I do rises to the level of teaching. I think that the social good, the overall benefit to the common good, even if it's more localized in teaching, I think is more pronounced. But what I do, I do what I do, and the reason I've enjoyed it as long as I have has been simply because I find it unfailingly interesting. I think it's a very interesting way to spend one's days, to try to figure out how to introduce ideas and counterintuitive notions into culture. And how do you do that in a way that is effective? And it has a component of commerce to it, a very strong component of commerce, because you can't obviously continue if you're not making money. But the commerce actually exists in the service of the mission of the institution, which is in this case to disseminate scholarship. So it's been, and that has really never changed. And I think given the times we live in, seems to me a more important function than ever before.
Yeah, well, wonderful. Well, so how did you personally discover that this is something that kind of breathed life into you, I guess?
Completely by happenstance, I have to say, because I graduated from college, and I think, one of the somewhat unpleasant epiphanies for many people when they graduate from college is the realization that, a significant majority of the jobs in the world are ones that they would actually ideally prefer not to have. I think there is real utility in doing work at a young age that you ultimately realize is not work that you want to do. So when I was in college and in high school, some of the jobs I had, I worked as a temp. I worked on a construction crew in Centerville, Virginia. I mowed lawns for a summer. this was all well before one had to credentialize oneself with a constant stream of internships. But probably the most influential job I had was when I worked, it was the opening restaurant. So the restaurant chain was just opening, and I got a job there at Chuck E. Cheese. And that was one of the singularly least enjoyable working experiences of my life. And I do remember very consciously thinking, I will apply myself in whatever way I need to avoid ever having to work at a job like this again. So it seems like an odd thing for somebody with the job that I do to say that the most influential job they ever had was at Chuck E. Cheese, but it really holds true. But I think that, I fell into it. I needed a job. I didn't want to live at home. I love my parents, did then, still do, but they live in a suburb of Northern Virginia, and I didn't really want to move back there as a person in my early 20s. And so I just took a job at Oxford University Press, which I was happily offered. And I will say the one point where I had a brief crisis of faith in the industry was when, because it is historically an industry that pays quite modestly, poorly at the entry level. And I didn't know, I didn't want to be singularly focused on money for my entire life. And I've never been more money conscious than those 3 years when I first worked at Oxford, because every dollar was precious. And I was working, doing overtime and working any sort of gigs I could get. I actually worked as a bodyguard for one stint, which is preposterous.
Wow.
The people who were being guarded by me were well unaware of how ineffectual I likely would have been if my services had been required. But no, I really liked the work, but I also did not want to be poor my whole life. And I think that's a dynamic that I think governs so many people's, it's I think a primary dynamic for many people in terms of their happiness is trying to figure out, how much is enough. And I think often in the arts and humanities, there is this reluctance to speak about money and about salary. But I think that, a lot of the literature has shown that in America, in many parts of the West, there is actually a correlation between happiness and earnings. That correlation in the US is right around $75,000. And you don't get, a great deal happier the more money you make. If you're a decam or a centimillionaire, chances are, a few more $1 million aren't going to make a material difference in your happiness. But I think the difference between feeling as if financial crisis is just around the bend at any given moment, and feeling actually quite confident that you can weather a storm because you have enough savings and because you have enough earnings. That's a huge difference, especially when children are involved. And I have a 24-year-old and a 21-year-old. So I'm hugely grateful to the industry of publishing for having given me the life it has, and for having enabled me to actually have a life that has, not necessitated my thinking about money all the time, but also enabling me not to miss really anything in my children's lives, whether it was important plays or birthday parties, what have you. It's a flexible industry in that respect. And I can't say how much I've appreciated that.
Yeah, that is huge. And I think from what you were saying, it's probably easier to define what you don't want, or to define it negatively, than what you actually do want as far as a career or life path, I guess.
Yeah, and it's not. I've been struck by a lot of the discussions in the last couple of months around people who are joining the workforce, and the perceived reluctance by people in management circles or middle age of these people to commit themselves wholeheartedly to the work, in the sense of working 70 and 8-hour weeks. And whether that's correlates to the pandemic or a generational suspicion of the way in which past generations have run the world and run their lives. One of the, for me at least, not immediately obvious consequences of this dynamic of people, even in their early 20s, saying, I only live once. I don't want to sacrifice a decade of my life doing work I don't want to do, simply to establish a degree of a modicum of financial security, is the people who are. This reflects a conversation I was having with somebody the other day who was saying, I'm in my mid-40s. I've worked hard my whole life. I have juggled a lot of things, and I'm now being told that I'm not actually a good role model And furthermore, I'm being told by my bosses that they want me to be a better role model in terms of projecting a balanced life, but they still want me to deliver in terms of the work I'm doing, which has required me to work very hard. So these generational differences have degrees of complexity and nuance to them that I think are run far deeper than, for instance, an article that appeared in the Times in the last couple of days, headlined "Why 37-year-olds Are Afraid of Their 23-year-old Colleagues," which I have to say I thought was one of the worst examples of a journalist taking sort of impressive and notable anecdotes, but using these anecdotes to somehow, appear to be reflective of an entire generation, which is always a dangerous game. But the anecdote struck me as both extreme and did not reflect certainly the experiences we've had at Oxford of the industry and the commitment and the expectations of our junior colleagues.
Yeah. Well, so that use of anecdotes is becoming more and more common they extrapolate the anecdote to entire populations, something you have called the tyranny of the anecdote. So how do we combat that? How do we face that issue, I guess? Or is it an issue?
It's funny because it really does come up constantly in my work life. Today, I have a meeting every month with all of our editorial books editors. And one of the questions, it's essentially an opportunity for people to highlight things that they think are problematic, call attention to things they think are going wrong. It's a sort of a beef session. And it's also, I think, cathartically useful to talk about things that you're struggling with and then to realize that other people are struggling with them as well. But one of the things that I wanted to do this time around is to ask people, so that it doesn't become too complainy, say to them, think back 10 years, we're talking right now about what our vision is for the next 10 years. But there have been a lot of people, it's been a very constant group over the past couple of decades. And so there are a lot of people who are working here in 2011. So I asked those people to think back to 2011 and itemize some of the things that they thought are better now than they were in 2011. And people say, our IT is much better. The hybrid working and the flexibility that that's brought with it has been incredibly helpful for our working lives. The fact that I'm not commuting as much is really helpful. The way in which we've changed our hiring practices. So it's not just somebody on a whim hiring somebody after a simple conversation, but we have hiring panels. That's become much more professionalized. We communicate better. We talk more internally about the publicity that our books get. Our books are better designed than they've ever been. Certain meetings that were mentioned as being particularly well run, the fact that our attendance at conferences and exhibits it's now been fully professionalized, and it was a really impressive array of things. And I thought to myself, at some point, anecdotes morph over into actually becoming data, and I think this is where we need as a species, because we are a storytelling species and we remember stories. Most of us remember stories better than we remember statistics, right? That's just not everybody, but I think most people do, because the stories speak to our emotional lives and people remember emotions. I mean, one of the things I always think about here is that, I've worked at Oxford now for 20 or more years, and I have a general sense of the trajectory of our finances from year to year. But I had absolutely no idea. If you go back to, fiscal year 2012, I don't have a clue. But I can remember very specifically how I felt at the National Book Awards when a book of ours won a National Book Award, or at the Pulitzer Prizes when we, won an award there. So I think that's how one has to actually denude the anecdote from emotion that amplifies the anecdote in a way that's unhelpful and is actually the opposite of quantification. And that's not to say you can't marshal and should marshal anecdotes effectively as a means of trying to tell stories and push agendas. But you have to do it in a way that's honest and that is representative. So this comes up, or has historically come up most frequently in publishing, when people who are advocating for a particular project will cherry pick and will say, well, this project, is a lot like this project, which did really well, but ignore the fact that there are 3 other books that are actually quite similar to it that all failed commercially. And so I think that's the challenge. And publishing has been traditionally an industry where people, go from the gut, and it's there's a great deal of subjectivity. And so trying to introduce a data-driven decision-making model while not losing the really important subjective human element of it is always a challenge.
Yeah, well, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you. I want to touch back really quick and just get your take. You don't believe in really a work-life balance. You believe in work-life integration. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an ideal. I think that there are a
Yeah.
lot of industries where that's probably hard to accomplish. Like, I would not want a work-life integration if I were working at Chuck E. Cheese still, right? I would be desperate to
Yeah.
punch out and leave my work behind and, focus on my life. But I think that there are professions where one is, the gift of leading an integrated existence offers itself up, and I think that is really the best of all possible worlds. So, as I mentioned, my wife is a teacher, and this was first brought to bear to me when my father, who was a lawyer for the government for many years and worked on treaties whereby he would travel to The Hague and try to get countries to agree to codes of conduct in cases of international child adoption, as well as international child abduction. So where two people get married, they have a child, the marriage falls apart, one person grabs the kid, goes to a country, most often the person grabbing the kid is a man, and goes to a country where women have no legal standing or have less legal standing than men. And these people, then these women never see their children again and are in this like nightmarish limbo as a result. And so he worked at that job for 35 years, and the treaties took forever to get ratified. But I was really struck by the degree of his engagement and the passion that he brought to that work. And I think that's that is just a professional blessing to be able to be that engaged. It brings with it some challenges, though, because when you have a clean break from your work, that makes it quite simple. And I, both in terms of my relationships with some of our authors who have become my friends, where I have to make, if somebody invites me to go fishing with them, I have to think to myself, okay, well, is this going to have any bearing on the next book contract we sign? And sometimes I think it won't. Sometimes I think it probably might, and then I have to go through the act of just declaring that and making sure that I'm not running afoul of any kind of conflict of interest. But I think that is a really nice. If you can have that, and if the people you work with actually become your friends and your social circle, that is a really nice thing. And so the fact that there are books that I read for work that I would otherwise be reading just for my own interest, and the overlap between what I read for work, subject matter wise, and the magazines I've subscribed to and so forth is almost complete. So I do think that is something that is really, it's relatively rare, but when you have it, it is just incredibly lucky, and it takes care of so much of that endless going back and forth between work-life balance, which I think is understandably, especially in this pandemic era, a preoccupation. What is the expression that people aren't working at home, but they're living at work? And I definitely live at work, but it doesn't cause me all that much stress, because a lot of the work that I enjoy the most is not actually stress-inducing.
That's good. Yeah. So it's more of an ideal that we can work towards and strive for. I have a question. Have you felt an increase in pressure to publish or refrain from publishing books that some may find offensive in today's political climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, do I feel the pressure? Maybe. I wouldn't actually describe it quite so much in those terms. I feel the need to make sure that the grounds via which we justify our decision around publishing or not publishing are sound and will withstand the sunshine test or public scrutiny. I think that what has been interesting to me over the course of the past 4 or 5 years is the evolution of my own thinking about the line between art and the artist. And we've actually published a book called Drawing the Line, which is about differentiating between the work and the person generating that work. Because I think it's safe to say that most everybody could agree that sort of bad people, terrible men in terms of their conduct, and I say men advisedly, have made astonishing art. And yet, to use an extreme example, we know, for instance, that Albert Einstein was decidedly unpleasant to the point of brutishness to his wife, but for those reasons, we would not, start to dispense with the theory of relativity, right? That's a sort of reductio ad absurdum argument, but it serves to make a point. Or take another point: if somebody who were had been exposed as a child pornographer discovered the cure for cancer, we would probably continue to avail ourselves of the benefits of that cure, even while decrying his conduct. So nothing in my world is that crystal clear. And I think that for us, the question we have in the past, I think, always drawn a line between the art and the artist, except in instances where the work itself is somehow rendered, sort of bankrupt intellectually by the person's conduct. So if somebody who proved themselves to be a sexual predator had written a book about post-traumatic stress around sexual abuse, that would be ludicrous for us to continue publishing that book. But I'm sometimes asked what our policy on these matters is, and I have resisted putting a policy in place because I think that it's almost impossible, in my experience, to write a policy that would be helpful rather than constraining when it comes to trying to adjudicate these questions on an ad hoc basis. So, but no, I wouldn't say I felt pressure. I would say that it is the arena has expanded for me, and I've also changed my opinion. Like, I'm no longer as absolutist, I think, as I was in the past about making that distinction between, in this case, let's say, a writer and that writer's conduct. And I think the one other thing I would say about that is sometimes these things are always, these questions, these decisions are always portrayed in terms of, bravery on the one hand and cowardice on the other, or cravenness on the other. And I think more often than not in publishing, if you're considering a book, the author's platform, which we talk about all the time, the author's standing in the community is part of that platform. And I think there's a commercial component to saying, I'm not passing judgment on whether somebody is guilty or innocent of something they've been accused of, but I do have to make a commercial assessment about whether or not this will have an impact on this author's audience and readership, and who's going to be of interest, to whom this book is going to be of interest. And so there, I have no problem saying this is not, I think, viable for us to proceed based on the unsettled nature of this person's reputation as a result of certain accusations. And, there, I think, are differing opinions about whether or not academia has yet had, its hashtag #MeToo moment. But we certainly, on a regular basis, find ourselves debating, again, how a new work by somebody who has been accused of certain kinds of behaviors, how that should be brought to bear on our publishing decisions. So I would say there's definitely more. I don't feel the pressure, but these discussions take place more than they ever have before.
Well, I have two more questions. The last one being about measuring success. The one before that, I'm wondering how you decide what to read. How do you pick?
Well, so in terms of besides.
Well, just besides, like, maybe the things that you're obligated to read to a certain extent as president of Oxford.
Yeah, so by virtue of the fact that everything I read for my work is nonfiction, I tend to gravitate towards fiction in my non-work reading. And I have actually, I could walk you down the hall and show it to you, but I have a bookshelf where a number of years ago, I made the decision that, life is too short. This was based on a calculation where I think I projected that, actuarially speaking, I had like another 35 years to live or what have you. And presumably I would not be reading at the cognitive level or speed I'm reading now for all 35 of those years. So I estimated that if I read 50 books a year, which I don't, so that was a high estimate, I would have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 books left to read. And that was a sobering realization, because that's not a large number of books. And so what I decided to do was, in one fell swoop, I think I bought 25 or 30 books, books that I absolutely knew I wanted to read. And I've made sure that I have, when I finish one book, I then restock the shelf, because my reading interests vary from I mean, actually, I've just finished this book by an Anglo-Nigerian writer called Bernardina Evaristo, called Girl, Woman, Other. And I'm reading a book called The Empire of Memory, The Memory of Empire, which is like a world-building space opera next. And they're both spectacularly good in completely different ways. And so, I think especially when you go into sci-fi and fantasy, the hit to miss ratio is skewed in favor of the latter. So when a book wins a Hugo Prize or a Nebula Prize, that tends to mean something. So I tend to go through like the Booker Prizes and just try to notch off the books I'm confident that I would like, and just refill the bookshelf, and that's worked out fantastically for me. So, and I also have a list of. It's embarrassing how completely primitive this is, but whenever people make a recommendation to me about a book or something they're watching, some streaming show that they're watching, what have you, I'm constantly emailing myself the same list that I just add things to and then subtract it to. And this first started when our children were younger, and I was I wanted to watch certain movies with them at certain ages. And I didn't want to forget what those movies were. So I thought, like when they were younger, I thought Paper Moon would be a good movie for them to watch because it features a young girl in it, and it's a great movie. And that should then just spiraled off into including things that I want to do, places I want to visit. And so this is now a fairly long document that I keep emailing to myself and adding to, and I need to go in there at some point and tidy it up. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. So
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's quite a list of books, I'm sure. All right. Well, thank you for your time today. My final question is, how do you measure success in your own life?
Yeah, when we had our first daughter, one of the things that my wife and I had a conversation around, how we wanted to parent and what we thought would be a successful, outcome of parenting. And we both come from families where our parents remained together their whole lives. And so and again, this sounds kind of ridiculous when you say it that way, but we concluded that what we really wanted was, we didn't really care all that much about whether our children were successful in any kind of standard way, but that what we wanted them to be was happy, which is, I think, what every parent wants. And the saying, "You're only as happy as your unhappiest child," for those people who may be listening who don't have children, is truer words were never spoken. But we then thought, what are the ways in which, generally speaking, the people we know, what dictates their happiness? And in almost every case, the happiest people we know are people who have lasting, meaningful relationships with other people, and who also are members of a number of incidental communities. So, for instance, in my life, at any given time, it may be that I play basketball with a group of people, I run with a group of people, I'm a member of a local food cooperative, I have my work community, I have my neighborhood community. Now that we have our dog Mabel, I increasingly know these people who, dozens of people who take their dogs into Prospect Park, with 2 blocks from where I'm standing. And I think having that, if you're a reasonably social person, is a really crucial thing. So I think that for many people, obviously, a faith community is a crucial part of that. So I think success is simply, if you don't endlessly agonize over the decisions you've made. And I think the way in which you arrive at that point is by having a lot of these different communities that you're part of, and where you feel at home, right? What's the Robert Frost line about home is the place when you go there, they have to take you in. And I love that line. And I think that if you have a number of places like that, and it doesn't have to be a physical place, it can be a relationship, it can be a frame of mind even. So I think those are the things to me that are that help define what I would consider to be a life well led and a successful life. And I think that a crucial part of that, and again, this is not, I suspect, a great revelation to many of your listeners, but is doing something, being of service, being of utility, and that I think can be really best achieved in these occasional communities.
Wonderful. Well, this has been Niko Pfund, president of Oxford University Press. Thank you so much for being with us today, Niko. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Devin. Nice to chat with you. Take care.
This podcast is a project of the Marriott Student Review at Brigham Young University. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Marriott Student Review or online at marriottstudentreview.org.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.